What's dark, mysterious, and drains all of your dopamine on social media? If you guessed a goth girl, you'd be correct. For the last 6 years or so, social media has been overflowing with goth girl related content. Whether it be an actual girl dressed in dark alternative clothing, dancing to metalcore, or a 34-year-old man with a 9 to 5 and 3 kids, thirsting over what he may consider to be a goth girl, is pretty much impossible to avoid, and raises some real issues in regards to objectification and of course the degeneration and perceived watering down of subcultures. These creatures have become a staple of any alternative or countercultural algorithm in the modern day, which got me thinking. I began to ponder the deep and rich history of the Gothic subculture that was born out of the 1970s UK post-punk scene, and how the current perception of a goth differs from what it once was. It seems nowadays anybody who dresses somewhat alternative and utilizes dark colors in their outfits is immediately slapped the label of goth. The term is no longer related to a style of music in the same way it was in the 70s. This is mainly because the people who listen to Gothic style post-punk in the modern day do not look like this. They look like this and are extremely Eastern European. Since the concrete birth of the Gothic subculture in the 70s, the representation of individuals within the scene has evolved and of course devolved countless times as media representation has shifted. They went from being presented as freaks obsessed with morbidity and deviantly sexual pastimes to quirky, endearing outcasts, and somehow all the way back to deviant freaks obsessed with sexuality through the development of social media, with the goth girl meme dehumanizing countless individuals who relate to the subculture. Despite the negative representation being the same, the vast majority of people nowadays that are labelled as goth look vastly different from the over-the-top and clearly recognizable style of the 70s. It's become a lot more subdued, with goth essentially becoming anyone who wears black or utilizes aspects of fashion that traditionally range from grunge to emo to nu metal. Although the way in which goth's definition has changed in the past 50 years may seem extreme, it's nothing compared to the ways in which the term was utilized when goths first rose to prominence around 1,700 years ago. Despite the original definition of goth seeming ancient and completely unrelated to this motherfucker, it's essential in understanding how the aesthetic and definition developed throughout history, and of course became essential to understanding the goth girl paradox. Let's go all the way back to 300 AD, drop the typical mall goth amongst these motherfuckers and simply see what happens. This was at a point in history where the Roman Empire was going pretty sicko mode, laying claim to the vast majority of Europe. This had been the case since around 27 BCE, with much of the art and architecture reflecting Roman culture. For example, the vast majority of buildings at the time would typically receive admiration from motherfuckers like this as opposed to motherfuckers like this. There is a reason, however, that we don't see dudes rocking tunics at the function in the modern day, well, most of the time, as the Roman Empire saw a significant loss in power due to goths. This may raise a few questions. How did a group of social outcasts overthrow literal Romans? Well, these were the first incarnation of the Goths, which were vastly different from what we see today. The Goths were a group of nomadic Germanic people that lived around the borders of the Roman Empire. They were composed of two main factions named the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, with the latter being the most prominent. The Visigoths were descendants of an earlier Gothic group named the Vingi, who had a pretty nasty habit of continuously invading the Roman Empire, although every time they invaded they had the shit beaten out of them by the Romans. It wouldn't be until 378 AD that the Vingi would defeat the Romans in a prominent battle, resulting in an alliance of some sorts. Well, it is slightly more complicated than that. The Gothic victory at the Battle of Adrianople led to the deaths of prominent Roman leaders, creating a power vacuum which caused barbarians to absolutely desecrate the Balkans for a few years. This continued until a new emperor rose to power, who quickly signed a peace treaty allowing the barbarians to settle on Roman soil as unified people. This was a huge mistake, as it was only a matter of time until the peace treaty would be broken. Things would become well and truly cursed for the Romans when this absolute Chad named Alaric became the first king of the Visigoths and immediately decided to completely desecrate the entirety of Rome. This monumental defeat resulted in the Romans losing a a huge section of Europe. The Goths took advantage of this, and much like the modern-day Goths laying claim to cemeteries and the algorithms of extremely down-bad finance bros, the Visigoths laid claim to land stretching from current-day Germany to Eastern Europe to the Baltic Sea. This is potentially the period in history when a group of people considered to be Goth were the most powerful. They weren't stuttering their way through a social interaction at a coffee shop, they had literally overthrown a huge section of Roman land, setting off the first domino that led to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which, believe it or not, likely allowed this motherfucker to exist through centuries of development in terms of art and culture stemming from the Visigoths. Although the Goths were successful, the wartime techniques they utilized were considered destructive and unethical, with the word Goth becoming a derogatory term to describe anything considered barbaric. The Roman Empire's influence over Europe began to fade. A huge portion of land previously owned by them got split between various nomadic groups, with perhaps the most prominent being the Goths. This led to a period known as the Dark Ages, which is perhaps the perfect time in history for a term like Goth to evolve, with the word slowly becoming more related to the definition commonly utilized today. Due to a more Germanic influence upon Europe, much of the architecture and art began to stray away from Roman-influenced styles. Much of the buildings no longer focused on realism and aesthetic proportion, instead utilizing religion and symbolism. One of the first examples is the Abbey of Saint Denis, utilizing pointed arches, large windows, and a spooky, almost skeletal structure. This style that would eventually be known as Gothic became extremely prevalent between the mid-12th and 16th centuries. The style was over the top and intricate, exaggerating small details to ridiculous levels. The buildings were commonly utilized for religious purposes, inspiring many of the key details and outrageous elements. For example, architects often attempted to build the structures as tall as feasibly possible in an attempt to reach closer to the heavens and therefore closer to God. This in turn meant the buildings often became the largest structure and therefore landmark of the city or town it was built. By the time the Renaissance period rolled around, this style was considered well and truly whack, with the architects of the time once again looking towards ancient Roman and Greek architecture when designing new buildings. It was around this time that the term Goth began to see actual relation to the dark and macabre as opposed to the chaotic and barbaric. When the 1500s rolled around, the term Gothic was still seen as inherently negative, inspired by the Gothic tribes that overthrew the Romans all those years ago. In the eyes of many, the medieval art of the past that came as a result of nomadic power over Europe reflected the downfall of a culture and style that was at the time being seen as beautiful by the vast majority of influential artists. One of these individuals was architect Giorgio Vasari, who began describing medieval architecture as Gothic, utilizing the term in a derogatory manner to refer to the style as crude and barbaric. The term became common lexicon and was used to refer to a period in time ripe with darkness and superstition. It just so happened that this darkness and superstition bred artists and writers who focused on the dark and the macabre. The 18th century saw an overabundance of architecture inspired by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and by that I mean just white pillars everywhere, just white pillars. The style had truly become mainstream, and of course, whenever something becomes popular, there's always a group of greasy, sludgy artists lurking in the background, ready to produce a style of art that is antithetical to what is popular. This resulted in architects fighting against what was essentially the mainstream by increasing their usage of Gothic techniques and styles within their buildings. Gothic architecture slowly became a trend within the upper class. Rich motherfuckers would have mock medieval buildings crafted for them on their property, and even began creating follies in their garden. This counterculture began to seep into literature. The 1700s was a period that valued scientific reason over anything else, with writers going against this typical convention by utilizing a style that focused more so on dark spirits and a fascination with the medieval period. These early Gothic stories were designed to be frightening and began to signify a generational divide in the art that was mirrored within society at the time. The older generation were often portrayed as villains and oppressive establishment, whilst the younger generation were seen as individuals attempting to escape a dark past, often spending long periods imprisoned or journeying through dark, dangerous pathways to escape the oppression of the older generation, which sounds a little bit like something we're going to get to later. See, this does all add up. I'm not schizophrenic. It was at this point in time that this style of writing was given the label of Gothic, with the term at that point finally being utilized this to define a particular aesthetic or style across various art forms. The dark romanticism labelled as goth began to meld with the architecture and art. It became a certain vibe. Goth became indicative of counterculture and was seen as a term to describe art created by individuals that sought to shake the status quo, whilst also using a particular aesthetic and style inspired by architecture that was only possible due to a barbaric Germanic tribe that defeated the Romans centuries beforehand. This laid the groundwork for the birth of filmmaking, with early Gothic films perhaps being the most important aspect contributing to the modern day goth girl. Many films created in the early 1900s were directly inspired by the dark romantic literature that had received the label of Gothic, and prominently utilised the femme fatale archetype. This archetype essentially defines a mysterious, beautiful and seductive woman who leads unsuspecting men into dastardly traps, which sounds like something we are all very much aware of in the modern day. This character has been utilised within Western literature since the Middle Ages, although only began to see real influence upon modern goth culture in 1915 with the film A Fool There Was. This film featured the actress Tedda Barra as the vampire. Barra is seen as one of the earliest sex symbols within cinema and utilised various modern goth staples within her visual style. Examples include dark clothing and makeup, with the latter directly inspiring what these motherfuckers would eventually lather all over their face in the modern day. Other films such as Das Kabinett, Des Dr. Caligari took the aesthetic and vibe described in early Gothic literature and presented it in a visually digestible manner. Although this is all starting to make a lot more sense, you're probably still wondering how a term's definition can go from barbaric warriors to a specific aesthetic used in architecture and art, and then suddenly literally anything alternative or quote-unquote different like in the case of the modern day. Well, unfortunately, we still aren't quite there yet. First, we need to explore what led to the explosion of goth music and therefore aesthetic and fashion within culture. The late 60s saw a countercultural explosion, only this era of counterculture was more so tie-dye, colourful beads and untreated STIs than black lipstick, fishnets and still somehow untreated STIs. That's right, the hippie explosion in the 60s saw psychedelics, peace and love skyrocketed to the heights of popular culture, although this would be extremely short-lived. Every time counterculture strays too far into popular culture, it can't even really be considered counterculture anymore, with this leading to another antithetical countercultural scene inevitably grown in the underground like fungus. This music scene was described by some as Gothic rock, with the term first seeing usage by journalist John Stickney to describe the music of The Doors after meeting Jim Morrison in a dimly lit wine cellar and pretentiously describing how it was the perfect location to meet the mastermind behind Gothic rock. The term saw occasional usage throughout the late 60s, often being slapped onto the darker and more edgy bands of the time such as the Velvet Underground. The term wouldn't see enough usage for an actual subculture to form, however, more so just journalists and critics attempted to sound intelligent by utilising a term you read in a history book while slurping overly expensive brown caffeine sludge. I can't chat though, I drink so much of this shit my heart constantly hurts. Whilst we're on the topic of chronic heart pain, the term goth would once again rear its head in relation to music after punk in the United Kingdom consequently gave every middle-class white British person heart palpitations. Unfortunately, however, first wave UK punk died in about as much of a spectacular fashion as it rose to prominence, with the genre splintering into various different sections of post-punk. Punks had had enough of attempting to lyrically insult the politics of the time in the most caveman-brained way possible, and instead shifted into bands that avoided the brashness and speed of early punk, and instead focused on atmosphere, echoing drums, and macabre lyricism. The first song that can truly be considered goth in the eyes of many is Bauhaus's debut single, Bela Lugosi's Dead, named after the iconic horror film actor from the late 20s with the same name, known for playing Dracula in the 30s. This was the first time a genre of music was so clearly inspired by the aesthetic and style of art that utilised the traditional label of goth. The song utilised tongue-in-cheek lyricism alongside a visual style from the band that paid respect to the Gothic films created 40 years beforehand. This style began to spread throughout the United Kingdom like some sort of sick bat-related disease, and I don't mean this one. Bands like Joy Division, The Cure and Susie and the Banshees signalled a new era for punk sonically, with the latter two specifically ironically inspiring much of the later goth fashion. Robert Smith and Susie Sue took elements from the more macabre aspects of Gothic symbolism and utilized it alongside the typical punk rock anti-establishment style. Specifically, Susie Sue, who had been a prominent member of the punk scene for years, received the label of Goth Mother, which meant something a lot different back then than it does today. As opposed to being a heinous label used by freakazoids on dating apps, the label Goth Mother referred to the way in which she inspired the fashion of every goth to come after, as her style was quickly replicated by countless individuals within the scene. Although the UK goth scene originally came as a result of music, the subculture wasn't entirely defined by the sound. The early music of the Smiths, for example, would sonically be considered very similar to bands like The Cure, although Morrissey just simply did not have the same level of steez as other goth bands. You couldn't just rip your shirt off, place a rose in your mouth and be extremely racist against Chinese people. There had to be a particular aesthetic. It's pretty similar to why Glenn Matlock was kicked out of the Sex Pistols for liking the Beatles and looking like this. Fashion and image has always been incredibly important to the music, especially during the 70s, when a lack of streaming meant that visuals were essential to receiving new fans. The goth style utilized the raw, rebellious attitude of early punk rock alongside a more introspective aesthetic, with the style of dress focusing heavily on dark aspects. Androgyny became a key element of early goth fashion, with many of the outfits taking inspiration from punk in terms of its sexual nature. In the late 70s, Vivienne Westwood became the most influential designer within early UK punk, and inspired many of the trends that would seep their way into goth. Westwood's designs prominently used items such as the corset, which in the past were designed and used to sexualize women by accentuating the curves and quite literally destroying a woman's ribs and insides. Although the corset was created with sexual intentions, it was seen as disgusting when actually viewed on a woman as opposed to being placed underneath a dress. Westwood took advantage of this, utilizing the corset as a statement piece to protest and take back the sexualization of women for decades. This became a common theme of punk that in turn made its way into goth fashion, inspiring many of the aspects that made girls extremely rich in the modern day. The fashion became an outlet for the mood set by the music. The punk offshoot utilized the angst and rage of 70s punk, although combined it with the atmospheres created in early Gothic literature. This in turn resulted in Victorian and Edwardian styles that were prominent during the birth of Gothic literature, being utilized amongst more punk-inspired elements such as fishnets and heavy makeup. The makeup was specifically prominent, designed to make the wearer look like a goddamn vampire, although more realistically made them look like a Victorian child stricken with illness. Of course, every subculture needs a home base, a place where each individual can feel comfortable expressing themselves, and this would come in 1982 with the opening of a weekly club night named the Batcave in Soho. This allowed the subculture to slowly brew and gather mold within the underground. The club's door would be a hollowed out coffin with bin liners and fake spider webs hung from the walls and the ceilings. The club would prominently host singers integral to the genre and style of goth, such as Robert Smith, Nick Cave, Susie Sue, and the entirety of Bauhaus. It essentially became the birthplace for the most prominent incarnation of goth. The style became synonymous with the term, and goth had finally become a subculture. Although the club closed in 1985, the subculture would only spread from here, seeping out of England and into Europe and the United States thanks to a countercultural magazine named Propaganda. Propaganda magazine would document the origins of goth and describe its slow growth into a global phenomenon. This allowed the style to reach more eyes and ears across the globe, with the influences of various other cultural aspects and genres seeping their way into goth culture. This started in the 90s with cybergoth, which looks like this and is incredibly stupid. The 90s also saw the rise of steampunk, which is essentially the Victorian elements of original goth fashion with a bunch of nuts and bolts glued on. Goth would then make its way to Japan with Gothic Lolita, which in typical Japan fashion takes the Gothic style and makes it perfect for PDF. These various Gothic offshoots began to warp what was commonly considered goth. This was only made more confusing by media representation, with the film representation of goth straying away from the femme fatale archetype and slowly portraying goths as quirky outcasts that were meant to be seen as endearing as opposed to feared and overly sexualized. A clear example of this this is Alison Reynolds from The Breakfast Club, which, although can be considered a more positive representation, further began to skew what goth even was in the public eye. Despite the confusion, Gothic culture was still able to come back in a big way in the 2000s, although it was slightly different to simping over Robert Smith. Mainly because Robert Smith looks like this in the 2000s, it was more so simping over Peter Steele. All jokes aside, it was actually more so the culture and fashion blending with other popular alternative subcultures of the time, mainly heavy metal with bands like Typo Negative, Evanescence and Cradle of Filth, essentially being both goth and metal visually. The mid-2000s essentially saw everything that was even slightly related to alternative or heavy music being molded into one big ball of clay, chucked to the label of counterculture and sold to you over the counter in a trendy new countercultural store such as Hot Topic. The record labels couldn't tell the difference, the store CEOs couldn't tell the difference, so why should you be able to tell the difference? This led to goth being marketed as a fashion trend targeted towards people outside of Susie and the Banshees listeners or Germanic tribe aficionados. This has caused a shockwave that still extends to the modern day. The prevalence of 90s and 2000s countercultural movements such as grunge, nu metal and pop punk / emo still ring true today and have a huge influence on modern day fashion and trends. This has therefore skewed the common definition of what a goth is. The early 2000s saw little differentiation in terms of media representation between various subcultures and styles that differed both visually and in terms of their rich history. Everything just became alternative, and instead of being targeted towards small secular subcultures on the fringes of society, it was marketed towards literally anyone who enjoyed alternative music. This is when we get to the modern day, where the goth label is utilized to describe people with a wide range of different styles and influences. Although modern day goth culture is still related to music, it's not the same as it was in the 70s. Goth e-girls aren't listening to modern post-punk bands, they're listening to any trendy subsection of heavy or alternative music, stretching from emo to pop to metal and punk. Don't get me wrong, traditional goths do still exist and typically receive the label romantic goth, although they're often found at festivals and gatherings specifically for gothic culture. This section is not prevalent in the slightest when comparing it to the internet's usage of the term goth, which has seen significant prevalence with seedy and negative connotations within the past decade or so. Fashion has always been a gateway into somebody's personality. What an individual is dressed in can define whether you see that person as attractive, likable, or disgusting. Regardless of how detached from images you claim yourself to be, this just simply is the case. This intense judgment based on fashion has only gotten worse due to the prevalence of social media. Now there's gorpcore, opium, cottage cheesecore, more styles of dress and fashion have spread, with inherent traits being immediately given to anybody that fits into that style of clothing. When it comes to music related styles such as goth, crust or mincecore, an entire subculture is immediately attached. Your first assumption is based on what they listen to, what activities they partake in, and how they live their lives. This just makes sense. It's easy to look at me, for example, and make a generalized guess on what I may be listening to or doing on a daily basis, and unless you guess slam metal and staring at the inside of my 4-wall flat, eating scrambled eggs and playing blast beats, you'd probably be wrong, but I digress. This concept seems to be lost in translation when it comes to the goth subculture. Upon viewing the typical goth girl, or even in some cases goth guy, most people don't assume they are a big fan of Susie and the Banshees and spend their time learning post-punk bass lines or studying 1800s architecture. The assumption usually strays towards something sexual. You've all heard it: step on me goth mummy, I need me a goth GF drag me into the basement, let me take a good whiff of your feet. Trust me, I've seen it all. I had to place my algorithm into an extremely dark place to research and find clips for this video. The most common connotation of goth in the modern day has become extremely sexual, although the worst kind of sexual, chronically online sexual. So how have deodorant deniers shifted the common idea of goth from a punk subculture offshoot obsessed with eyeliner and Robert Smith to a hyper-sexualized figure that will drag you into a dark, dim basement before dominating you and proceeding to make you a warm glass of milk and your favorite brand of seed oil-ridden tendies? Well, for some reason, as the 2010s shifted into the 2020s and things became increasingly cursed to the point where even I find it hard making jokes about it, the idea of receiving a goth GF became a mainstream meme, to the point where finance bros and gilets, who have never even clicked on a Pinterest image of a gargoyle, are seeking out their perfect goth GF. This may make zero sense to individuals actually aware of goth's deep subcultural roots, although it can be easily explained by the early 2000s countercultural sludge I discussed earlier. As the lines between subgenres and cultures become blurred as a result of mainstream meddling, the common consensus of what something is changes. Most people can't be f***ed to research the history of goth culture, so they're just going to assume it means a certain thing based on the mainstream media and common representation they've seen. These people aren't interested in researching the innate differences between first wave emo, scene queen and goth. They saw a woman with big tit, black lipstick and pink hair and went awooga awooga. Online culture has degraded the way in which we communicate with each other, with the awooga awooga being a common example. This extends to friendships and socialization with heinous applications like Discord, join mine by the way, and even core aspects of our species and humanity with dating apps. Dating apps are pretty heinous overall, and for some reason, an alternative or quote-unquote goth girl increases the potential degeneration tenfold. Any girl that even happens to have a septum piercing will receive consistent messages from men or even women encouraging them to ruin their lives in one way or another or partake in an outwardly sexual act. This clearly connotes that the typical goth girl is packaged with a sprinkling of overtly negative mental health issues, with the stereotype obviously stemming from the negative emotions portrayed in a lot of the music consumed by the typical alternative individual, as well as the media portrayal of first wave goth. This obviously becomes harmful when a goth girl is simply trying to live their life and is unable to escape the unhinged label, regardless of whether the person is suffering from mental health problems or not. This may seem like just the fault of crusty male gooners, but it doesn't seem to be the case. During my research, which involved attempting to mold my Instagram Reels algorithm into a goth girl lover's paradise, 70 to 80% of the memes and posts I saw actively promoting the negative stereotypes surrounding the typical goth girl were created, posted, and encouraged by women, clearly in an attempt to divert traffic to an page. It seems like the aesthetic has been taken by people who aren't interested in the culture, apart from, of course, having Sex Tape by Deftones appear on their Spotify Wrap. They just utilize the style to sell a certain product, with that product just happening to be extremely sexual content. Although the goth culture is still thriving in the background with healthy scenes and festivals encouraging the traditional subculture, the mainstream idea of goth is becoming overcrowded with individuals utilizing a subculture that has become incredibly sexual in an attempt to sell a product. Goth has completely degraded into a sexual subculture as opposed to something that traditionally didn't see much sexualization outside of the clothing-based protests utilized in the traditional punk offshoot. So why has goth become so sexualized? Well, there are plenty of clues to look towards within the subculture's history. The first example can of course be the fact that one of the first representations of goth within a visual medium was a character under the femme fatale archetype, which is inherently sexual in nature and primarily designed for the male gaze. We can then shift our very male gaze to early punk, which utilized overtly sexual themes to protest against the status quo within Britain at the time. Aspects of this then seeped into early goth culture, with many of the prominent fashion items being based on clothing that traditionally had sexual connotations. We can also, of course, look towards social media and a certain style of, let's say, content becoming increasingly more acceptable when attempting to analyze why the f*** everyone is so goddamn horny all the time. This ever-increasing sexual culture, alongside connotations that link goth and alternative women to sexual aspects due to a misunderstanding of its deep history, has resulted in a culture that is just deeply sexualized. This all, of course, raises issues in terms of both the health of the goth subculture and, of course, more overarching problems in relation to how people are treated based on the way in which they look. I see the subcultural issues as less prevalent. As I've mentioned previously, aspects of traditional goth culture are still very much alive today, with people alive during the subculture's birth as well as newcomers who are well educated and appreciative of the history continuing to give back and show immense passion towards the scene. This scene has, of course, strayed away from the music somewhat, although let's be honest, punk wouldn't be punk without the safety pins and Adam's apple, and goth wouldn't be goth without the fishnet tan lines and permanently deformed rib cages. It just so happens that punk saw much more development musically in the decades since its birth than goth has. I think the more prevalent issue is more so caused by our continuous evolution in into an online world as a society. Only the boldest of motherfuckers would go up to a girl with black lipstick in public and start furiously barking. But on dating apps, it's as easy as literally getting out of bed, although that task is probably quite hard for these motherfuckers. Most subcultures that can be sexualized in the modern day are being sexualized. You see it in the hippie movements, punk movements, even country and traditional farmers are being sexualized. It's just a fact that sex sells. It always has, it always will. And it is just an unfortunate fact that aspects of Goth's history has resulted in it receiving a more sexual label than other subcultures, whether that label is ignorant or not. Although this is a problem, Goth culture will stay alive. The original subculture is cool enough to always have fans and appreciators, and it just so happens that members of the real subcultures are incredibly passionate and appreciative and will always give back to the Goth scene. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where I present the Goth girl paradox. If a modern Goth girl took a time machine back to 300 AD, entered a Visigoth territory and immediately reduced the morale of the warriors due to her unstoppable yap session, which ranged from topics such as Knocked Loose being on Jimmy Kimmel to the price of black lipstick, would this reduce the Visigoths' power, aura and motivation to a level that would leave them unfit to overthrow Rome? If they were in fact unable to overthrow Rome, would Gothic architecture and literature cease to exist? Would the term Goth be lost to time? Would this said Goth girl then morph into a motherfucker in a toga, or would this Goth girl simply cease to exist? If this Goth girl ceased to exist, surely she would be unable to go back in time in the modern day and lower the morale of the Visigoths, meaning they in turn would overthrow and sack Rome, which means she should puff back into existence, creating a never-ending paradox. I'm not gonna lie, I actually have no clue what the I'm currently yapping about. I actually didn't know what paradox even meant before writing this video.